weaknesses or even sometimes embarrassed our country on an international scale, right? I'm the first to say that. But another side of me thinks that truly there's nothing more candid than this about our government. I mean, when we talk about an open door policy to our government and the reason we have FOIA, which is Information Act request, where you can request information from the federal government, it's all about that open door policy, wanting to know what's going on behind closed doors with our decision makers. And in kind of an ironic, beautiful twist, things like eliminating media as the middleman enables our government to speak to us directly and tell us exactly what's going on behind closed doors. So pettiness aside, pedantics aside, I think it's kind of cool when we can hear from our national leader about a decision.
Cool might not be the...
I'm a big open door policy when it comes to government and things like this. They obviously had a disagreement about international. We can get to the substance of it, but I think that there is a benefit to not having to go through third-party outlets to really understand what's going on.
And so here's where I would disagree with you. There is there's a story about President McKinley that he was about to get his picture taken, and he realized that he had a cigar in his hand. And according to the anecdote, he said he told the photographer, he's like, "Stop. Our young men are going to see this. Let me put aside my cigar." Like there was a certain maturity and there was just a certain awareness that other individuals are going to be peering at him and going to be modeling their behavior or providing cover for bad behavior. And so he decided to put his cigar aside. And in this particular instance, what I would hope is that we wouldn't see this pettiness of back and forth especially in light of there's so much going on behind this that I think is worthy of conversation right now. Ivy, your thoughts on this?
I agree with both of y'all that it's really awesome to be able to have that straight from the person without having it filtered by the media, which we know can twist it in one direction or the other. But I think also, as Nick was saying, it's kind of the responsibility of the person in that position to realize the maturity and level of, way that they interact through speaking in a way that the whole world will see that they're representing the whole country and that it should still come from them and still be honest, but still be maybe a little more well thought out and professional.
Yeah. Go ahead.
We are always going back and forth, Nick and I, on this point, because I don't think there's a dichotomy there. I think, of course, I can say about this specific instance, like, what would wisdom say? Does it make us look weak on an international scale? Like, that's more to the substance of the point. I'm talking more about broadly speaking from a structural standpoint and institutional standpoint, that we are even sitting here able to hear from our president on Twitter directly what his thoughts are. To me, that just shows how much society has really changed, even from when I was little in politics. And in a lot of ways, the White House is more approachable from the public. It's more the people's White House than ever. And that's probably a populist statement to make. I recognize that. But I'm thinking more broadly, less specifically, insert Obama into this scenario. I think it's interesting to see how the institutions have changed and how information flow has changed. That's a case study for me.
Yeah, Calvin Coolidge had like a proportionality principle where the more he talked, the less he thought he was succeeding. And so there was this anecdote that someone came up to him at a party and said, "Can I get someone bet me that I can't get you to say 3 words?" And he responded and he said, "You lose." We've got to go back. We got to take a break, and we'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The Electoral College has become a controversial issue in the last 2 decades, but a recent federal court ruling could make it even more controversial. Judges in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that presidential electors do not have to follow the results of the popular vote in their states. Some worry that a single elector could decide the outcome of a presidential election in a close election. The decision was a victory for one Colorado elector who decided not to vote for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. Instead, he crossed out her name and wrote in John Kasich, then the Republican governor of Ohio. The Colorado Secretary of State removed him and brought in another elector who voted for Clinton. The court ruled that once electors are chosen and report to their state capital in December, they cannot be removed, nor can the state nullify their votes. In the past, the court has ruled that a state may bind the electors, but those laws are weak, and the penalties for being a faithless elector are nominal. It is worth mentioning that the ruling from Colorado conflicts with an earlier ruling from the state of Washington. The state Supreme Court there ruled that electors must follow the results of the popular vote. Now that there are conflicting rulings, it is likely that these cases will make their way to the Supreme Court. Given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, it's difficult to predict how the justices will rule or whether they'll even rule at all before the 2020 election. Nevertheless, I predict that the High Court will uphold the Colorado ruling, given the fact that in the past there have been faithless electors in America's history. And I also predict that some justices will comment on the constitutionality of the Electoral College, given the fact that we've had 2 elections in less than 2 decades decided by the electoral vote rather than the popular vote. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Ivy Nichols as well as Chelsey Youman. And we have been talking about the former now NSA, National Security Advisor to President Trump, John Bolton, was either 1, asked to resign, or 2, did resign last night, and we are left in the middle wondering what is it? What's the truth of the matter? It was, I guess, just to give you a timeline very quickly from the previous segment. Just this few minutes ago, within the hour, President Trump said that he has asked John Bolton to resign. John Bolton then, in turn, said that he offered his resignation last night, and so we've got a little bit of a timetable crunch. But I want to highlight a particular tweet that I thought was just kind of hilarious, but also kind of illuminating to a large degree. It says from Jeremy Dunleavy, he says, quote, "You've got to admit that getting fired for opposing bringing the Taliban to Camp David the weekend before 9/11 is a pretty good explanation for the subsequent gap on your resume," which I thought was...
John Bolton will have no shortage.
It was kind of
no
funny.
shortage of job opportunities.
Yeah, that is obviously clear that he won't. Obviously, he served with American Enterprise Institute, served before that in the Bush administration as the UN ambassador for the U.S. At the UN. And so now and also a Fox News contributor. I would imagine that there is going to be a couple of people knocking at his door, wanting his services moving forward. But I wanted to help us, give us an up-to-date of what's actually happened. Where really the source of kind of the conflict has emerged in this particular area. So you have over the weekend news breaks that there were plans that were put into place for the Taliban officials as well as Afghan government officials to come to Camp David the weekend before celebrating 9/11. Obviously, the Taliban played a pretty significant role for that infamous date that is on the American calendar. President Trump had decided to try to bring these forces to Camp David, this historic site in the woods of Maryland, in order to kind of broker a peace deal, because we now find ourselves upwards of 17, 18 years, 2,300 of our men and women, brave men and women, have lost their lives in this particular fight. And so this this camp, this emerging peace deal was broke off. President Trump canceled it due to a variety of issues. One being that from the previous week, there was an American soldier that lost his life in a car bombing suicide attack in Kabul, which is in Afghanistan. It illuminated the policy disagreement. What we know from President Trump is he is what is known his spirit, or I don't want to say that. He is what is known as a dove when it comes to particular foreign policy issues. Would be characterized as that. He very much wants to pull out from foreign soil. He wants to move out of a
some would say isolationist.
Yes, but there's more of a dove propensity with him on that realm. And then if we put it into a dichotomy, is what I'm saying. So there's the individuals that are more dovish in nature, and then there are the individuals that are more hawkish in nature. And that is where Mr. Bolton would fall in. He was very antagonistic and very aggressive when it came to his approach relative to Iran, when it came to his approach relative to North Korea. But what we've seen with President Trump is very much a propensity to want to talk with these individuals, significantly trying to broker talks with Iran until that was called off at the previous UN meeting earlier this month, trying to twice over meeting with Kim Jong-un, with the leader of North Korea in Singapore, as well as obviously just recently taking the step over into North Korea, stepping foot onto North Korean soil just recently, trying to broker peace. And so there's the attempts to broker peace, whereas Mr. Bolton is much more of an aggressive individual when it comes to brokering peace and making peace, i.e. wanting to do it through force. One individual is wanting to talk softly. Another individual is wanting to swing the stick wildly.
You're referring to Bolton?
Yeah. Yeah.
Did he want to increase our presence in Afghanistan?
I don't know if it was increase our presence in Afghanistan, but he did want to. He had much more of a aggressive approach. We haven't heard a pretty strong stance. We do know that over the weekend there was a significant disagreement over this peace agreement that was coming forward out of Afghanistan. Now to help you understand, though, there's a lot. This peace agreement process has been going on for almost. Some would even say over a year now. And to understand, there's a multitude of parties, but there's three in particular parties that are wagering for peace right now in Afghanistan. You've obviously got U.S. coalition interests that are there right now that are trying to make sure that they're leaving Afghanistan better than where they found it. Obviously, it was a haven for terrorism. You've got another sect, which is the Taliban. The Taliban have found refuge in Afghanistan. And then you've got the Afghan government is the third party that's there. Now, what the Taliban want is one of their their cutoffs. One of their significant things that has to be done in this Afghanistan peace process is they say that the U.S. has to leave. And so, with the U.S. having to leave, what they are saying is we won't even approach the peace agreements until the U.S. leaves. Well, U.S. interests are saying that the Taliban will never reach peace with the Afghan government if we're not there to do it. And so that's the big disagreement, if that makes sense right now. And so we find ourselves at a place now where we're moving into, I think it's 17 or 18 years. I can't remember, that we've continued to just sacrifice and we continue to bravely fight in order that Afghans might be free. And there is this burbling disagreement now over where we find ourselves, where President Trump very much has shown a propensity to want to move, to have troops come back to the U.S. We're at a low point right now. Latest number I saw is 13% of our armed forces are outside of the U.S., which is a much lower number than has historically been kind of concurrent, which is usually around 15 to 16%, if those numbers, if my memory serves me correctly. And so we've got that piece that's moving right now, whereas John Bolton would argue that we have to be much more aggressive in these particular areas, and it can't be just through the diplomatic table that some of these things happen. You've got to, for all intensive purposes, you've got to punch them in the mouth if you want to bring about peace.
Well, I think it's broader than that. So first of all, everybody has heard the saying, or should have heard the saying, you don't negotiate with terrorists. Right. That's the
Yeah,
first
yeah,
thing
yeah,
that
yeah.
comes to mind is how ironic this is. But I think we have to take a step back and remember that this is the first president, at least in our recent history, who has an executive business background. And like every single issue he tackles at the White House, he approaches it with his business background in mind. And so he wants to negotiate. He's an expert negotiator. Everybody, his entire life, even as a real estate mogul, just applauded him for his ability to have incredible negotiations and move the ball and get what he wants accomplished. So he is extremely talented in that realm. The problem is when you apply that mentality, a real estate negotiation mentality, to literal terrorists, or as we talked about multiple times on the show, North Korea or Iran, and in the international relations and on the diplomatic side, we have very rarely ever seen a president entertain meetings with tyrants and communist leaders and terrorist groups, or be willing to even do that in the same way that President Trump exhibits his willingness to do that. And so there are two very real arguments here. One is President Trump probably thinks he can move the meter, is learning a lot on the international relations side. But he was very open and adamant that he made the decision to invite the Taliban and did not consult with anyone. So he's making these decisions in a silo, and that he made the decision personally to cancel the meeting. And so those are two problematic sides to this. I think that we would probably should defer to the Department of State a lot when it comes to some of their guidance and history on this.
Mm-hmm. Ivy, any thoughts?
I think that it seems a little bit like he's trying some things from his background, but he's also not sure what's actually going to work in a presidential and foreign relations setting. I think maybe it would be better to have the idea and then, like you were saying, discuss it with everybody and then hold fast to trying to carry that through, rather than to try something and then immediately pull back if it seems like it's not working.
Yeah, to a certain degree. I mean, I know this is going to be a stretch comparison. He kind of reminds me of FDR in this regard. FDR would often consult with his cabinet, but at the end of the day, he would often make the decision. And that would be different from individuals within his cabinet. President Trump, what we know to be true, is an individual that consults with his members of his cabinet and has largely deviated from them in certain regards, to the extent that probably the most negative event that we remember is what happened when he stood beside President Putin of Russia and said that he believed President Putin over his own intelligence officials. And so now we find ourselves in a situation in which the North Korean agreement has yet to come, which is a pretty significant thing, as well as the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is another significant thing. And now we have this Taliban agreement, which is another significant thing that we'll continue to talk about right after this.
Digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Ivy Nichols and Chelsey Youman of a Human Coalition Action. And we have been talking a little bit about President Trump and John Bolton and the ending of a season, but we're going to end that segment and move on to the 2020 election. So as we continue to see news begin to percolate and news begin to be made in D.C., one has to wonder if there is any news that we can trust. And this brings us to the next topic that we've got to discuss. And Ivy, I'm going to be really interested to hear your opinion on this. So apparently we cannot, fake news is being significantly propagated on such websites as Instagram, which is, I guess, just it's very sad for me because I like Instagram a whole lot, and I don't want to fall for fake news on Instagram. But nevertheless, a recent report indicate that Instagram could become the new breeding ground for disinformation in the lead up to the 2020 election, according to a new report from New York University. Deep fake videos, domestic disinformation, digital voter suppression, and Facebook-owned platforms like WhatsApp and Instagram pose the largest threats to the U.S. as the country looks ahead to the 2020 election. Disinformation is increasingly based on images as opposed to text, according to Paul Barrett, the author of the report from NYU Center for Business and Human Rights. Instagram is obviously well suited for that kind of meme-based activity. And so for our listeners, a couple of definitions. One, Instagram is a social media company, primarily where there is images that are put before you, either videos or just memes, which are modern day political cartoons or modern day cartoons for all intensive purposes. And obviously fake news, there's a difference to be made between fake news and biased news is what I always want to delineate. Fake news is essentially lies. Biased news is just running news through a very framed and altered particular angle. And so, Ivy, when you heard about Instagram, the place that has given me so much joy because of the memes and the funny videos that I see day in and day out, like Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former governor of California, on a tiny horse that I like to call Sebastian, I'm very disheartened to know that they are beginning to propagate fake news. Help me to understand your thoughts.
Well, I think in the past, people didn't have as easy access of platforms, and they kind of had to be a professional in that field to be able to get that news out to people through books or newspapers or whatever else. But nowadays, it's so easy for literally anybody who has no real knowledge of a subject to create information. And it seems like information now is spread more based on whether or not people like it or find it funny or find it, riles up their emotions rather than opposed to it being true. And it's just so easy for that to be created, but also to be spread nowadays and to be talked about. And sometimes as a millennial, it's hard to tell on the internet, whether or not something's true, because if it's not from a verified source, you may think, oh, this has a chance of being true and mention it to someone else. And you don't have so much time during your day to research every piece of information that you come across. So it's a little bit hard to discern, and it's pretty easy to propagate nowadays.
Your thoughts, Chelsey?
I think that pretty much anyone on any of these platforms who is a user should probably take things with a grain of salt, right? Like, we all have our own minds and intellect and decision-making ability. And so, the goal is ultimately for people to do their due diligence to get to truth. But realistically, would that happen? Probably not. The primary user of Instagram is going to be millennial and younger individuals, the next generation. They're not really a big voting bloc. So I always, whenever we talk about these issues, come back to, we've heard statistics that Russia tried to meddle in the election, and we've heard about, false campaign advertisements and false information, but we've never actually seen statistics that truly impacted and changed voters' minds. I mean, I don't know if that's ever been quantified or if there's a really good way to quantify it. So first and foremost, would misinformation on Instagram actually sway an election? It has the potential to, but that would require the millennials to be voting and also to change their minds from their other, what I would call information sources. So you might get information from the news, you get information from your parents, you get information from friends. There's like a multiple platforms that feed into your worldview and your political opinions. If you bother to try, right?
Have y'all ever identified this? This is just going to obviously be a convenient sample. Have y'all ever identified fake news on social media, on Instagram, or fallen for fake news on social media?
Does Babylon Bee count?
Babylon Bee is a satire website. No, Babylon Bee does not
Sometimes
count.
I read it and I'm like, wait a minute, this seems weird. I don't tend to pay attention to ads. So I kind of filter it. Like if it's not someone I recognize, I actually don't like look that hard at it.
Okay.
So I can't answer definitively, but I'm also not particularly easily persuaded by other people's political opinions coming at me.
And I would argue too, and I'm going to argue for you or argue something about you, probably is the better point, is that you're probably not getting your news on social media, on Instagram, I should say.
No.
Yeah. Okay.
No,
Ivy,
I'm not.
Your thoughts? Have you ever identified fake news on Instagram? I want to be specific here. On Instagram, or have you ever fallen for fake news on Instagram?
Well, I'm not on Instagram as much as I am on Facebook, which is a very easy place to share fake news.
Okay.
So I don't think I've fallen for fake news on Instagram, but because, like she said, I don't really fall for the ads, and my friends don't really post that stuff as much.
Mm-hmm.
But on Facebook, I know people will share things, especially like information about political candidates that you seem to agree with. And so you think maybe it's true, and like you pass it on and then you find out it's not true. So I've become a lot more careful about that after accidentally falling for one of those.
Well, the other thing too that I'm thinking through is the only way this actually affects our politics is if it changes your physical vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So something now for a vote next November, it's really not going to have a high level of efficacy assuming the individual even votes to begin with. So to me, like what I would view as the prime time for this to be evaluated is election day. Like what ads are going out on election day? Is it with people who are registered? Is it with people who are already at a polling site? That's more relevant to me.
So here's where I would disagree with you relative to efficacy, because one individual, I would say that it's not just next November that voting begins. I mean, if you're a Democrat that's listening, welcome in. Voting begins as early as February, I believe, is when Iowa caucuses start.
Right. I
mean, so there's that
relative
piece.
to the time you're voting.
And so-
The polling
and
centers
then
are open
here's
physically.
where I would say, and the second piece that I would say is that you're building up confirmation bias. You're building up anchor points on particular perspectives that you have, and so these fake news is inculcating inside of you, solidifying positions inside of you that could be detrimental to actually the opening up of new information as it comes to be, as it comes to you. So if you continue to hear that Donald Trump is a racist, Donald Trump is a racist, Donald Trump is a racist, that's going to build something inside of you that's going to keep you from actually hearing the truth, which is, or at least as I've deemed it to be true based on my understanding, Donald Trump is not a racist. Sometimes he makes questionable remarks that if you have a built-in anchor point that he is a racist, you're going to see racism in everything that he says. And so if you've built that, if you inculcated and solidified that mentality, the fake news, that he's a racist, he's racist, he's racist, but you haven't been given any evidence to that particular claim, it's going to frame the which.
But how is
everything
that
else.
different than biased news?
Because he's not a racist.
Right, but there's already narratives that are out there. So if we're talking about like the headliner elections,
See,
right?
that's
So the names people don't start yelling at me yet. You know what I'm going to say. Tone it down over there. If you start okay, who are we talking about? Are we talking about the household names, the top of the list when you're going to vote that you see, you're like, I recognize these names. Those narratives have already been developed for years. I don't believe there's a new narrative we will ever hear about Trump. There are actually articles I've read about this of why he's so untouchable is everything's already been said about him.
So
I'm not finished. So the second question would be the lesser known candidates who are down ballot. that's where name recognition really comes into play for if it's a straight ticket vote, which in Texas we no longer are, actual name recognition being swayed. And by then, I don't know that you would remember all the narratives being developed 6 months before.
And this is where I think it's important.
Primary.
And now we've got to go to a break. You've taken all my time.
I love doing this to you.
All my time.
One last note.
No.
Campaign evidence does suggest that timeliness of the information is the single greatest contributing factor to voting.
Completely agree. And so what happens, though, is
you peak 3 weeks before election day. 3 weeks.
Fake news and biased news feed into one another like they're a monster, and they devour things. And so fake news sets a false perspective for an individual to have, and then biased news feeds that and strengthens that. And in a negative partisanship arena, I think it becomes detrimental to the American experience. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In our last episode, we learned that memorials with religious symbolism bear a strong presumption of constitutionality, according to Justice Alito's majority opinion in the American Legion versus AHA. But what does that mean? Well, to fully appreciate the court's decision, you need to understand how these lawsuits once worked. Previously, if someone saw what the Supreme Court calls religiously expressive monuments, symbols, and practices, a lawsuit could be filed based on little more than the offense of having been exposed to such a thing on public property. It was called offended observer standing, and as Justice Gorsuch made clear in his concurring opinion, if individuals and groups could invoke the authority of a federal court to forbid what they dislike for no more reason than they dislike it, we would risk exceeding the judiciary's limited constitutional mandate and infringing on powers committed to other branches of government. Instead, those merely offended by the presence of a religiously expressive monument, symbol, or practice must now rebut the presumption that such religious displays are constitutional. That's a far more difficult standard to overcome, and one certain to dissuade suits from even being filed. Of course, there's a reason why the court shifted the burden, and on our next episode of the First Liberty Briefing, we will discuss how the justices are combating hostility toward religion. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined by Chelsey Youman of Human Coalition Action, as well as Ivy Nichols. And we were talking about fake news. So here's my working theory right now. The reason why I think it's these two go together and they're so detrimental to the American experiment, because the American experiment, this is a beautiful project that the government is our opportunity to be able to secure those God-given rights that we have. And there has to be a level of trust that saturates that. And here's what I think fake news does, is this fourth state, fake news and then the biased news. I think fake news sets a false data point for us And then biased news substantiates and feeds that like a beast. So that for example, the fake news being Donald Trump is a racist, the biased news continuing to frame everything that President Trump does in a racist manner. So it's the beast that is fed this particular data point that makes it detrimental, so that when you hear new information with a confirmation bias, you're more likely to rationalize it away. A perfect example of this outside of the Trump racist claim would be your mother. And so I'm going to broach the subject that no one should talk about, is someone else's mom. And so your mom, you have a built-in confirmation bias about your mom. And
that's true. Foster loves me so much. He asked me to marry him last night.
No, okay.
He said he would bet me 5 rings.
Oh, wow.
I was like, that's more than I have now. So.
Daniel, what are you doing?
Not 2, 5.
And so what happens when somebody talks a negative word about your mom? Well, you have got years of experience. You've seen significant sacrifices and a litany of examples of their undying love that they have for you, and you have a very positive view of your mother, that a negative example is either rationalized away, 1, or is swept underneath the rug, 2. So that because over the years you've had a data point that's been secured about your mom, and then you have a ton of evidence that substantiates that. And this is where I think is just so detrimental about fake news and biased news. They work hand in hand. And making it even more significant is the negative partisanship. So now the research is very clear since the 80s and has only intensified in the 2010s. Now we're living in a world where we're not voting for particular people. We're voting against particular people now than what we've ever done before. Chelsey.
Mm-hmm. What?
Thoughts? Disagree?
No, I agree with you. I've always been on fake news.
Yeah.
I'm on fake news in terms of like adamantly opposed to it.
Have you? Okay, so I want to switch over to. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
What I was going to say is that I agree with you. I think that people are more and more distrusting of it as an institution, and that because investigatory journalism is at an all-time low, and I can say that through personal experience for years and years with journalists who call me about a client or a case I'm working on, ask 2 questions, and then write a story having no actual information or understanding of the case, right? So I'm speaking, that might be too much of a personal experience of mine, but like, I think that people have come to an understanding that the news is biased. They inherently distrust it. The fact that fake news is now like a household term that we use, when before 2016 Trump started using it, it was never something we ever spoke about, I think is actually a huge win. The media is under a ton of scrutiny, and the networks are hurting because of it. So they have less viewers than ever. The numbers are down. The investors are down. So really, to me, there's going to be a day of reckoning for the press, and there should be. We need intellectually honest, reliable news sources. Now, beyond that, if we're talking about specific electioneering, that's a different subject, because are we talking about the district races? Are we talking about city council races, countywide races? When you get to that level, some of this technology and the ads and the targeted marketing schemes gets very expensive. And so we have to ask who's actually perpetuating the false ads and what's really the impact of those ads. So that's really what it boils down to me. But I agree with your assessment entirely about biased news versus fake news. But frankly, the narrative, if we're talking about the big ticket voting block for President Trump or against him, the narratives have played out. People have drawn their sides. People have their preconceived ideas. I think it's a foregone conclusion.
But here's where I think it becomes more detrimental. And tell me if you agree or disagree with me or not on this. Is that I don't think we're living in an age anymore where Tip O'Neill once said that all politics is local. I don't think that's the case anymore. No. I think all politics is national now, so that individuals are no longer voting for their particular. They're no longer voting for an individual one. They're always more often than not, they're voting against someone else is the first claim I would make. And then second, whether that person aligns or disaligns with the national party figure. So for example, I am represented by Colin Allred right now, my congressional seat. Colin Allred is my U.S. congressman. He's representing me in D.C. as we speak right now in this very moment.
He's doing a whole lot of nothing as we speak at this very moment.
And so I have an opportunity. I know that there are going to be individuals in the 32nd Congressional District that are given the choice as to whether they don't see Colin Allred. Some of them might not even know that they're represented by Colin Allred, but they're voting either for President Trump's particular person in his party or that's aligned with him, or they're voting against President Trump's person. Does that make sense? Or do you agree,
Right.
disagree? And that's
Yes.
relative to fake news. I think that could be very detrimental.
Yeah, absolutely. And in Trump's presidential campaign, I did not want Hillary. I didn't prefer, he wasn't my ideal candidate, but I didn't want her. And I was thinking, I'm going to have to vote for him just to not vote for her. Ended up voting for a third party candidate who came on at the last minute. But I totally understand that. I want to go off of something that Chelsey had mentioned earlier about the day of reckoning for the media. I hope that comes, and I hope that they all turn around and start reporting on real news as it is. My concern is that a lot of people don't trust the media, so a lot of them have stopped reading the newspaper, stopped listening to the radio as much because they don't feel like they're getting much of substance for that amount of time. And it seems like the people who are mostly interested in that a lot of the time, and who still have faith in that, are the people that are just trying to listen to or read the sources that agree with them. So it kind of creates this echo chamber effect a little bit, which is really concerning. Because as we were talking about during our break, I feel like a lot of people are just looking for some reason to get riled up. So I hope that the media will become respectable and trustworthy so that Americans can get real news as opposed to it just polarizing everything.
That would be incredible if we could turn back time. I think what you're speaking to, I know we have a break coming up, so on the other side, I'd love to talk about what really, Nick, you're discussing is it's actually two political science theories on why voters vote the way they vote. And so I've got some really cool background information on that if we decide to carry it over.
Yeah, I think we'll definitely carry it over. I think one of the things that we'll have to discuss too is what do we do when we're living in a world in which so for example, there was someone that responded to me on a social media platform earlier this morning about something I wrote in the daily briefing, and they took qualm with a point that I made. And in a shocking twist, somebody disagreed with me. And so I cited my source, and immediately the person didn't even click on it, because you can tell when somebody engages with it, and two, just the sheer time that they responded to it. They said, "Oh, insert media outlet, fake news, duh." And I thought, you didn't even click on it. Just by seeing the website, you just immediately discount it out of hand. And I agree there might be a past where they have misreported. They might have said something, but the fact that you're not even willing to engage with the source is, I think, very distressing moving forward. But we've got to take a break right now. But when we come back from the break, we're going to continue talking a little bit more about the implications of fake news coming into the 2020 election right after this.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome to Point of View on this Tuesday, September 10th, 2019 day. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Chelsey Youman. And Chelsey, how are you today?
I am good.
So Chelsey is from Human Coalition Action. And Chelsey, so tell us a little bit. We've got quite a show for our listeners today, and we've also got Michael McAfee that's joining us over the phone as well. Michael, how are you today? Okay, it's so good. And so he is going to be joining us over the phone for the next hour as well. And then we're going to have quite a show for you. There's been some late-breaking news over the hour. John Bolton, the National Security Advisor for President Trump, has announced his resignation. And so we've got John Bolton announced his resignation last night. But apparently, according to President Trump, he said his services would no longer be needed on Twitter. And so now we find ourselves in the middle of a employment disagreement, or rather a lack of employment disagreement.
That's better said.
And so we'll be talking a little bit about that. But then I think during the first hour, what I want to give a little bit of attention to is fake news. And so specifically, there was a new report that was put out that indicated that fake news was one of the main purveyors of fake news leading up to the 2020 campaign, according to NYU's Center for Business and Human Rights, is going to be taking place on Instagram. And so on Instagram, you're going to, because it's more image-based than it is word-based, it's going to be more difficult to identify fake news. And kind of the working model that I had in my head that I came up with is that there's a difference between fake news and between biased news, but they work hand in hand one with another. So fake news gives you a false claim in which an anchor point, and then biased news feeds that particular claim. And so, for example, if the claim is Nick Pitts is a racist, and then you just have tons of biased news that continues to say Nick Pitts is a racist, or frame stories in which there's racist overtones in the news, then all that's going to substantiate is continuing to further solidify the claim.
Or my favorite trick in the book, which is just sprinkling any article relevant to the administration or not with President Trump's name. I even read an article this week that literally it was about telemedicine and abortions, and it was talking about what a phenomenon that's becoming. It didn't so much as refer to a single agency, executive or otherwise, and somehow they squeaked his name in there so that it's going to come up on
search engine optimization. And so how fake news and then biased news works hand in hand one with another. And so, Michael, I'd be interested in hearing from you. So just based on your own experience, on your own Instagram scrolling, have you ever identified fake news on Instagram, or have you ever fallen for fake news on Instagram?
Does the Babylon Bee count?
That was Chelsey
Michael,
made the exact same. I
said the exact same thing last hour. So great minds.
Did you guys coordinate on this?
There have been multiple times that I read the Babylon Bee and fell for it, but I'm very gullible.
I am with you. It's hard oftentimes to, on satire. And so the Babylon Bee is great. Snopes, I don't think understands the humor, but I think it's great. So But no, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Like, we've all fallen victim to fake news, which is why especially millennials are so disenchanted with historically trusted news sources and would much rather listen to something that our friends tell us, because our friends, we have a personal relationship with them. We know that they don't have an angle, and it's easy for anyone, not just a news organization, but anyone that's trying to put something out there has some form of spin, is trying to put forth some kind of a narrative that's going to cast them in a great light or cast their opponents in a bad light. And so, yeah, like this, it's a big problem and issue, and makes it all the more important for Christians to be mindful of seeking truth and to not just obviously truth in the scriptures, but also to have a better, a more robust, full understanding, because it's easy to see even a headline that's misleading you, and it takes you towards down either that fake news or that biased news that you're talking about. I think those are really helpful categories.
Yeah, so the researchers cite the false claim that the Odessa shooter in Texas was a Beto O'Rourke supporter that first appeared as a tweet from a far-right account. However, that tweet was turned into a screenshot and shared by a bunch of proxy accounts before it was taken down for violating Instagram rules. And so, Chelsey, you were talking a little bit about kind of some of the political science concepts that are around this idea of fake news. And one of the things that I thought was just so interesting is, again, the point where if you feed someone a lie about someone and you continue to feed it that way, eventually they'll come to believe it. But not just that, then if you frame every story around that thing. So again, we can use the president if you want, which has been used by a wide number of media sources, or you can use me, for example. If you say the lie that I'm a racist, and then every story around it has racist undertones, you're going to be further fed, even though it's biased news, by the fake news that said I was a racist. It's going to further solidify that, and then in a negative partisanship environment where it's not necessarily you're voting for someone, but you're voting against someone else. I think there's some dynamics here that we need to be aware of in coming into the 2020 election, right?
Sure. So I think I can probably say I can agree completely with your theory regarding fake news and biased news and confirmation bias and extending narratives. Mm-hmm. Where I think we disagree, Nick, is for me the actual impact of that, like quantifiable study showing that it actually changes an election or moves the meter for voters, because I think voters have already made up their minds.
Okay.
And I don't know that it's always based on whatever they're fed or told.
Okay.
I think that voters have an independent mind and independent leniency one direction or another, whether it's from their economic raising, their social background, their education. I mean, there's a whole lot of things, their race, their sex, all of those things make up an individual voter's, and in our case, religion. I'm thinking of Democrats, so I don't know. I didn't say that. I'm sorry. But, you have all of these, I guess, feeders into developing your political platforms and ideological stance. From there, you get confirmation bias or not. And for me, that's the outlet that the media comes in, is after maybe things have already been developed. And then further, and I've said this in the last hour, I'd like to repeat it now. When it comes to like Instagram specifically and these ads, I don't think that we've ever seen a study that shows that it actually swayed an election. We know there are attempts to sway the elections, that the Russians attempted to do that, but we don't actually know quantifiably that they switched voters, because a lot of people using these platforms are millennials. They're not even registered. So really you'd have to have a targeted marketing scheme to registered voters at a time where efficacy is high, which is actually polling day.
So
when they're at the polls or they're in the vicinity, and statistically speaking, campaign political science theories show that the 3 weeks leading up to an election is like the most pivotal time for any campaign to gain those median voters, the undecided voters. So for me, it's like, if I saw an ad today, is that going to impact the election next year or play into some narrative? I don't buy that.
So here's where the question that I would raise to you is it only important relative to voters switching their vote or an election being changed, or is it important because mistruth is being put out? We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The Electoral College has become a controversial issue in the last 2 decades, but a recent federal court ruling could make it even more controversial. Judges in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that presidential electors do not have to follow the results of the popular vote in their states. Some worry that a single elector could decide the outcome of a presidential election in a close election. The decision was a victory for one Colorado elector who decided not to vote for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. Instead, he crossed out her name and wrote in John Kasich, then the Republican governor of Ohio. The Colorado Secretary of State removed him and brought in another elector who voted for Clinton. The court ruled that once electors are chosen and report to their state capital in December, they cannot be removed, nor can the state nullify their votes. In the past, the court has ruled that a state may bind the electors, but those laws are weak, and the penalties for being a faithless elector are nominal. It is worth mentioning that the ruling from Colorado conflicts with an earlier ruling from the state of Washington. The state Supreme Court there ruled that electors must follow the results of the popular vote. Now that there are conflicting rulings, it is likely that these cases will make their way to the Supreme Court. Given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, it's difficult to predict how the justices will rule or whether they'll even rule at all before the 2020 election. Nevertheless, I predict that the High Court will uphold the Colorado ruling given the fact that in the past there have been faithless electors in America's history. And I also predict that some justices will comment on the constitutionality of the Electoral College given the fact that we've had 2 elections in less than 2 decades decided by the electoral vote rather than the popular vote. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I've got Michael McAfee that is joining us over the phone right now, and we've got Chelsey Youman of Human Coalition Action. She's joining me here in studios, and we've been talking about fake news. I put the question on Chelsey, and we will see.
The unfair question.
The unfair question.
Completely unfair the way you asked that.
I here because I'll ask the question to Chelsey. We've been talking about fake news. Study at a New York university indicates that Instagram, because it's more picture-based and it's harder to identify the text that's in pictures rather than just having an AI bot kind of go over, read the words on a particular post of some sort, especially when it's a picture age, is fake news is it only pertinent, is it only bad insofar as it changes an election, or is it bad simply because it's lies that are pervading the environment?
Okay, now I have to talk because I don't think that's a fair way to frame it. Speaking of biased news out of Nick Pitts right now.
Is it biased news, or is it just a leading question?
No, it's a leading question. I'm an attorney, so I don't get with that. I think one is a question on the moral problem that is fake news and biased news. And to me, there's no doubt we agree about that. Like, it is a moral depravity. Lies and perpetuation of misinformation and untruth is what I trade in, especially now that I work against the abortion industry. So the moral depravity of it is not, to me, the question. It's a question of quantifiable impact in terms of how does it actually change society and what is the impact on a political scale from voters voting based on misinformation. And of course, that there's more implications of that, but really I'm talking about more like we could nail this out in statistics, right? So I wanted to just frame it that way.
Okay. So you're saying that it's only bad. So help me understand that though, because
I'm not saying anything's only bad.
Okay. So
I'm saying I agree with you on the moral depravity of misinformation.
And here's where I think it's even further. I would move further from the moral depravity piece. Is that so? I go back to John Adams and say that our Constitution is wholly unmade for a group of people that lack morals, right? And so I think that strikes at the heart of the American experiment. One, when you continue to allow this to be pervasive, and I think the second piece about it that makes it so bad is that these campaigns, more often than not, yes, they're targeting independent voters, but they're also targeting, more often than not, they're targeting individuals that have already cast their ballot early, that have already signed in their check, and they're hopefully utilizing them to be the surrogate for them in order to win over their independent friends that have yet to make up their mind. No?
I didn't hear the question.
No, I was just your response to my assertion.
So statistically speaking, because I'm going to get back to the impact of the misinformation, now that we agree on the depravity of the fact that there is misinformation, is a political science study. There have been two traditional trains of thought, one that was prevalent throughout the 50s through about the 70s, and then one that got a little bit more popular in the 90s and gained traction through the 2000s. And these are the two trains of thought. Everybody's familiar with them. First is the importance role of motivating your base, which would be during the primary election, people who are already on your platforms and agree with your ideological stance. That would have been the older theory, but also, it was quantifiable in terms of voters. Motivating your base, but there's a tension between that and the second theory, which is, do you need the median voter to win?
Okay.
Do you need your base to come out to the polls or the median voter or both? And these two theories have always been in tension until a study came out in 2017 that nailed out the difference, like which theory wins. And the truth is it's both and neither. And I thought this was so fascinating. And they studied and said the primary reason a voter is motivated to turn out to vote, be it a median voter or otherwise, is fear of the opposing candidate's stance. And so the more loudly you can speak against your opponent and bring their voice to life, the more you motivate someone to come out and vote against them, which we all can see with Trump and Hillary Clinton is like the perfect example. So many evangelicals did not support Trump personally, but came out to vote because it was anti-Hillary. That's a great example. But they also showed if your candidate is not particularly motivating, if you're a mainstream voter and you're in the base, then there's a depression that comes out if you have no one you feel like you can vote for. So I thought that was really fascinating. When we're talking about fake news, I think that plays directly into what we're talking about, which is it depressing voters from coming out to vote because they see no one they're excited about, or is it actually encouraging, in this case, what would be like the Democrats as a main party to come out and vote against Trump because he is the greater evil?
So
it's a fascinating question.
Would it be a fair characterization to say that your study kind of illuminated the larger kind of characteristic of today's voting environment, i.e. negative partisanship? It's not necessarily that individuals are voting for people, they're voting against particular people.
Yes, there was more to it than that, and I should just quantify that. This was not my personal study. This is a University of California study that came out.
And here's where I would put the question to Michael.
But it was issue oriented, so the study was specifically relating to stances on issues, not just the actual individual.
Okay.
In fact, they showed that the more like character assassination you do, the more depressed the rate is because nobody cares as much about the personality anymore.
So help us to understand, Michael, from your vantage point, from a biblical perspective, help us to think theologically about this. In a negative partisanship era where there is more of a propensity to try to get individuals to vote against particular candidates instead of for particular candidates, do you think this is a good thing? Do you think this is a bad thing, biblically speaking? I'd be interested. I've got a couple of thoughts, but I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously we want, perfect love casts out fear, right? And so one of the things I just think principally is I don't want Christians to live or vote in fear of what would happen if not. I think that it both assumes the worst of people and also and can be a motivator that drives us to vote because we think that sort of God needs our help or something, which I say all that, I mean, with all the obvious caveats. I'm a huge fan personally and supporter of Human Coalition and a lot of the legislative items and groups that you all would be very much in line with as well. So I'm not saying sort of a political abandoning of our responsibilities, but I do think that as Christians, we have a view of our political view is informed by our eschatology, of an understanding of where we're going, how the world is going to end, which is ultimately that God is in charge of all things and he's going to bring reconciliation of all things at the consummation at Christ's return. And so I do think that should help inform and drive us that we can, when it comes to our political engagement, not live in fear of what could happen if we don't stop this person or that group or whatever, but rather to say, how do we advance, drive forward in love? Because inevitably, every time there's been a setback of some sort, a supposed setback for the church, there's always some kind of ground that seems to be gained that we didn't see coming before, and vice versa, that oftentimes when we have something that is perceived as a great win, there's often a cost that was unforeseen. And so I think that if nothing else should give Christians confidence that, yes, we should be engaged and yes, we should vote our convictions, but also we can rest at the end of the day that we've done what we can and then leave the results and kind of what's to come to God and not put our hope in a person or a political party to save us.
Yeah, and we have got to take a break. And so when we come back from the break, we're going to pick up on this conversation and really hone in on a particular issue, i.e. abortion. And Chelsey, I think this is going to be really helpful for a variety of reasons that you're going to be able to lend your voice to this. News came out of Ohio that 2 Planned Parenthood clinics have been shut down. And so, but then also a part of the political conversation is what are some of those ways in which we can engage with our elected officials and put pressure on them to really move the needle on this life issue is what I'm really interested in. Kind of illuminate that. Last night I had the chance. Dallas Baptist University hosted Dallas Mayor Eric Johnson on campus, and it was just another reminder of how important it is to be able to engage with your elected officials instead of just reading about them in the news, instead of just seeing particular points in large settings. It was a great opportunity in a small town hall forum to be able to press him on issues of relative to homelessness that we're experiencing right now, relative to crime that we're experiencing here in the Dallas area, and really press him not necessarily on what he's against, but rather what is he doing to alleviate some of the crime and try to bring down some of the crime that's happening here in Dallas. What are the measures that he's taking? And the second piece is, what is he doing to decrease the number of individuals that are living on the streets right now? Because it brings a whole host of issues that Christians should be concerned about, and to really put forward and put questions on. Don't tell me what you're against. Tell me what you're doing to eradicate some of these issues and deal with them. And so we'll talk about abortion, though, right after this.
So when people first hear about MediShare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become MediShare members? 2 big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With MediShare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kirby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of... I almost called it Facebook. Welcome back to Facebook.
For some of our watchers, it probably is welcome back to Facebook.
So welcome back to Facebook, you Facebook watchers. And for the rest of you, welcome back to Point of View, the Millennial Roundtable. We've got Michael McAfee that's joining us over the phone, and Chelsey Youman of Human Coalition Action that is joining me here in studio. And we've been talking a little bit about particular issues that are, we're talking about fake news in particular. And so we were kind of highlighting particular issues before we went to the break. And one of the items that I wanted to bring before your attention today is the decrease that though we're seeing a national decrease in the number of abortions that are being administered here in the U.S., there is increasingly a move to have individuals that are traveling further to be able to get abortions. And so I bring your attention to an AP article that says at least 276,000 women terminated their pregnancies outside their home state between 2012 and 2017. For context purposes, there's been around 950,000 to a million abortions that are performed every year in the 2010s. So this study of 276,000 women terminated their pregnancies outside of their home states over that 5-year stretch is probably, I would say, I'm not really good at math, 276,000 would be approximately 25% during that time. And so 25%, 12.5%, set 6%. So probably around 3% of pregnancies that were terminated during that time. And so this brought to mind in kind of a little quip that I came up with is the idea is that Mary fled to keep her child, but an increasing number of mothers are fleeing to get rid of their child. And I can't imagine the thoughts that are running through their minds, but a growing number of Americans can. And so, Chelsey, from your vantage point, because you're so specialized when it comes to state policy relative to the pro-life issue, do you see this as continuing to be a number that grows as we continue to see more and more of these heartbeat bills that are passed, that individuals are going to travel even further across state lines, especially when we take into account that 2 Planned Parenthood clinics closed in Ohio. So you're going to start seeing more individuals that are fleeing to neighboring states to be able to get these abortion procedures done.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the case. I think I read maybe 168 abortion clinics have closed in recent years. Mm-hmm. And Planned Parenthood, all we need to know is Planned Parenthood itself, which is the key ringleader. 1 in 3 abortions in the country are performed at Planned Parenthood. They're the kingpin of the abortion industry. They have a plan on their website to actively increase their presence in pro-abortion states and to increase access. They're adding telemedicine. There was even an article that came out. Telemedicine is a huge component of this. So for our listeners who may not be familiar, before 10 weeks, an abortion can be induced through the administration of drugs. And so a drug-induced abortion, no real facility. And they are doing this online over the internet. They're FaceTiming with women and then giving them a prescription for these pills. The women never see a doctor in person, never get examined. Then they go to the pharmacy and pick up the pills and have at-home abortions. And that is like the biggest growing trend in the abortion industry, which, by the way, I don't see any groups addressing this issue from the outset. So I'd like to flag, if you are in a state that is not looking at telemedicine abortions, go to hucoaction.org, sign up, contact us. Like, this is something we definitely have our eye on. And that's just in the United States. Now there's also increased international access to drug-induced abortions, where an international doctor in the Netherlands created aid access, and women go meet with her, again, video chat. They get the prescription filled in India. Mm-hmm. The pill is shipped internationally from India to her doorstep. She never sees a doctor. It's not FDA approved. There are horrific things happening and trends happening in the abortion industry. So make no mistake, even though it sounds like a good thing that abortion clinics are closing statewide and women are having to travel to get those, which naturally is going to decrease the ability for women to get an abortion, abortion is still an evil. And so just because it's legal, the article said, doesn't mean it's good. I think that's a great point. But the goal here should be bigger for us as a community. And that is, how do we help meet and stabilize these women's conditions so that they don't have to go through these methods to obtain an abortion? There will always be alternative avenues out there, and it can feel like whack-a-mole a little bit with that. But the truth is, the average woman obtaining abortion already has a child, lives well below the poverty line, and will lose her housing if she has that child because she can't afford rent. So we're talking about some big picture issues as a society to help create what we call at Human Coalition, like a national rescue system for children. And what does it look like to create a systemized approach to helping women so that they don't seek these alternative avenues to an abortion?
So I want to illuminate part of your comments because I think it's really helpful for us to highlight and to emphasize this particular point. So you're saying to me that even because there used to be a day that all we had to do was shut down these clinics in the state, because the abortion issue is really a state's issue to a large degree. But now you're saying that there is internet capabilities for individuals to meet with a doctor online and receive these abortifacient drugs to eradicate their pregnancies and not have to travel.
Never leave their home.
Is that the next evolution in this?
And we're there. Planned Parenthood is open about increasing their telemedicine services to overcome these obstacles on the clinic side. They are increasing their presence in pro-abortion states. They're increasing clinics in pro-abortion states. So don't forget that we have a very active adversary on this front, and I don't just mean the devil. Mm-hmm. So, there are other methods that they are already looking towards, mm-hmm. and that they've frankly already been occurring.
Okay, help me to understand, because there's a piece of this that I've heard is the boogeyman, but not much has been said about it. And one of the things I'm concerned about is that when we're shutting down some of these clinics, naturally what you have is there's certain luxuries that come. And like you talk about how so many of these women that are getting abortions are living below the poverty line. I think about the internet as being very much a luxury, not something that's necessarily afforded to certain women, a large percentage of women, I would imagine, that are looking to get an abortion. Do you imagine there's going to be an uptick in the black market of abortions moving forward if you have individuals that are largely so desperate to be able to get these services and they can't access an internet website? Do you imagine that's going to increase?
Well, for the most part, everybody can access the internet through their cell phone. So even below the poverty line, many women still have cell phones. Okay. But yeah, there's already an increase in quote unquote the black market. So I read an article that was really disturbing, guys. I have to read some horrible things, but doulas who are not medical professionals, never really been medically trained. There's abortion doulas now where they have access to these abortifacient drugs and they are handing them out to women. There were literally women learning how to conduct actual abortions who are not in medical facilities, and they're practicing on papaya fruit, which for calling like PRCs, pregnancy resource centers, fake clinics. This was like the most ironic thing for me to read ever. But yeah, there are people actually being trained and training doulas to perform abortions. And they say it's not your grandmother's back alley abortion. I mean, these are horrific things that are happening. But for the most part, y'all, abortion is legal in our country. Mm-hmm. It's widely available. Yes, that there are some travel upticks here and there, but we still have an uphill battle to really come around these women, care for them, actually stabilize their conditions and their circumstances so that, and this feeds into the foster care system. I mean, if we stabilize a woman's conditions and she keeps her child, which is the goal, then we want the child to be in a good environment and a safe environment and not succumb to domestic violence, which is a huge issue in these areas too. So there's a lot for us to think about as a society broader than just the actual physical regulation of the industry. Yeah.
Michael, what are your thoughts on some of this that's happening? I can't imagine, from a church perspective, I just can't help but think that the church has a role to play in this, and where so many women are having to travel so far when they don't even need to they don't need to travel to be able to find hope and to get an abortion. They can find a community and find hope in their local church, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, that's something that my wife and I are passionate about. And we're so grateful for Human Coalition and other organizations like them that they're serving. HUCO is a huge leader in this space. And we're grateful because it allows the church to be freed up to do what the church is supposed to do, which is to come around, wrap around these women that are in a difficult circumstance. You guys would probably know better than I do, but the statistics show that the vast majority of these women don't want to have an abortion. They feel like that's their only option. And so being willing to, as the church, step in, lean in, show that care and love of Christ, and be able to not only save a life, literally a physical life, but also have the opportunity to be a part of seeing spiritual life transformation in a woman that potentially doesn't know Christ is how the church should respond.
That's great. And so we have got to take a break right now. But when we come back from the break, I want to dig a little bit deeper into this, because what we're finding isn't just that individuals are traveling far to be able to receive an abortion. Just more individuals are having to travel far for medical attention. We'll be back right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In our last episode, we learned that memorials with religious symbolism bear a strong presumption of constitutionality, according to Justice Alito's majority opinion in the American Legion versus AHA. But what does that mean? Well, to fully appreciate the court's decision, you need to understand how these lawsuits once worked. Previously, if someone saw what the Supreme Court calls religiously expressive monuments, symbols, and practices, a lawsuit could be filed based on little more than the offense of having been exposed to such a thing on public property. It was called offended observer standing, and as Justice Gorsuch made clear in his concurring opinion, if individuals and groups could invoke the authority of a federal court to forbid what they dislike for no more reason than they dislike it, we would risk exceeding the judiciary's limited constitutional mandate and infringing on powers committed to other branches of government. Instead, those merely offended by the presence of a religiously expressive monument, symbol, or practice must now rebut the presumption that such religious displays are constitutional. That's a far more difficult standard to overcome, and one certain to dissuade suits from even being filed. Of course, there's a reason why the court shifted the burden, and on our next episode of the First Liberty Briefing, we will discuss how the justices are combating hostility toward religion. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to Point of View. This is the problem that we have on Point of View on the Millennial Roundtable. The conversations that sometimes happen off air can bleed over on air. And so I'm going to go ahead and blame my co-host, Chelsey. Is that feels right?
That's
just to go ahead and blame her on that. I introduced her to an app. Michael, have you ever heard of the Pocket app before?
No.
Okay, let me change your world for a second.
I want it.
Okay, so you download Pocket app, and this is good for our listeners. Maybe if the people of Pocket want to get on, we'd be happy to introduce you. So Pocket is an app on your phone. You can download the app, and you can save articles onto your phone, and then you can click a button when you're reading the article in the Pocket app that it will read it for you, and so it's like an audible article for you. And so we were talking, there's one article that we'll be talking about here in the next hour, for example, is Jerry Falwell and Liberty University. There was an expose in Politico magazine that kind of detailed some scandalous material that was happening at Liberty University. But it's a pretty long article, very substantive, very good article, but it's a longer article. And so I was sharing with Chelsey that you could read it, which will probably take around 25 minutes. Or you can listen to it, and you can listen to it a little bit quicker, and it can take 19 minutes. Pretty cool, huh?
awesome. Yeah, I use the speak screen, the swipe to read on my iPhone all the time. I'm gonna have to check out this app.
Hold on, what is this that you're telling me about?
So there's a setting on your iPhone where you can arrange for your speak screen, is what it's called. It's in accessibility and language or whatever. And so then if you have an email that you have pulled up, or you have whatever, a Kindle book or something that you don't have the audio book for, you swipe with 2 fingers down from the top of the screen and it will read to you.
Wow.
Now, admittedly, it sounds somewhat robotic because it's not, you know, a live person, but it at least can get you. It helps me a lot whenever I'm on a drive and have an email that I need to get read or whatever. So.
Wow, I had no clue that this was available. Well, what do you know? Technology helping us. What a great segue to how can the church help people that are in need as well. And so, is that a bad segue? Is that a bad?
That's awesome.
Okay, thank goodness.
To the mass.
Okay, so we were talking about what was happening with the closure of 2 Planned Parenthoods in Ohio. More individuals, according to an AP report, are traveling across state lines to be able to get abortions. This is just a devastating article, devastating news to be able to hear. The good news out of this is that we're continuing to see that more and more women are choosing not to get an abortion. Abortion rates have gone down over the past 3 years, which is something to celebrate. But what we're seeing, though, is that individuals are still traveling, though we're shutting down abortion clinics in their communities and in the states. They're still traveling across state lines to be able to get an abortion. But this brought up a particular point for me, which some of my friends that are pro-choice in nature, that are Democrats, when I bring up these issues, one of the things that they often say is that, well, you only care about the child when it's in the womb, and you don't care about the child once it's outside the womb. And I always push back, because I think there are a variety of measures that Christians take, and I want to take their critique to heart. But it did bring up another point for me when I was doing research for this, and there's a new study that indicated that 23% of rural residents said that access to good doctors and hospitals is a major problem in their community. Concerning suburban residents, that number is 9%. The average travel time to the nearest hospital for a rural resident is 17 minutes compared to 12 minutes in the suburbs. Another study found that waiting for an ambulance takes 10% longer in a poor neighborhood compared to a rich one, averaging an extra of 3.8 minutes. And I was thinking about it from the Christian perspective. We see the Good Samaritan as well as the Lemuel. They both remind us that God cares about both the unborn child as well as the hurting child. And when you have more and more women, or more and more of these individuals that are traveling further and further to be able to receive the necessary medical care, I can't help but think that there's a responsibility as well as a beautiful role the church can play to help bring comfort and help bring grace to these individuals that are suffering right now. And so, Chelsey, I'm going to start off with you, just if we deviate from the public policy standpoint, but from your vantage point at Human Coalition, there has got to be research. There's got to be maybe stories that you can share, best practices that individuals can replicate to help women and to help these individuals that are considering getting an abortion.
Absolutely. So let's start with the first fact, which is Human Coalition operates or partners with 43 clinics that serve pregnant women across our country. And we're not just talking pregnant women, we're talking women who have already decided they want an abortion. And so these are what we call abortion-determined women. And that is actually a niche field. It's very difficult to find these women. We have to use a lot of technical ways to do that. So I can't personally speak to this, but Human Coalition can speak to who the women we're talking about is more than anyone. They deal with these women every single day, whether it's through our call center, where they're taking in these women. So the tangible obstacles these women face, the average abortion-minded woman, she is living well below the poverty line, probably has an hourly wage job, if that. Childcare will cost her about $1,000 a month. So if you start thinking about living below the poverty line, to even keep her job. She probably won't be able to pay for childcare. And then the other massive obstacle is usually housing. Sometimes they're living with a partner who's violent. Sometimes they're not in safe situations. Sometimes they just won't be able to afford the housing when you add in the childcare cost and the formula cost. We're not even talking about feeding herself or diapers. So these are very real obstacles that I think a lot of times in the pro-life movement, it is easy to talk about the child, but we can't talk about the child without understanding some of these social service aspects that go into the woman's decision to keep her child or not. And so at Human Coalition and so many other pregnancy resource centers, their goal is really to come alongside these women and stabilize their circumstances. 75% of our clients, when asked if we could change these circumstances, would you want to parent, say yes. 75%, which leads me to believe that we need to understand these are not women with a quote unquote choice like the left pushes down our throats. These are women who feel like they're under duress, they are desperate, and they need help. And so we as a society need to come alongside these women. Also, one in three women who have an abortion are actively attending church. So these are women in your pews. They are fathers in your pews who are pushing women to have the abortions, who don't want to father or might even be abusive. And so I really put a lot of this on church and Christians as communities to come around these women, and we need to do what it takes, even through government alternatives, to really empower, I think, the most underrepresented population in our country.
Michael, what are your thoughts on this? In light of being a pastor, being a teaching pastor at Council Road, what are some of the things that you're encouraging some of the individuals in your congregation to move forward to help move the needle on the life issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's several different sectors that they can get involved in, and so obviously not obviously, but oftentimes the first ones I think of are either politically to encourage those representatives of theirs to vote for life, to let them know that that's something that they care about, as well as the baby rescue, and those two components are critical. I also think there maybe is probably an importance for us to begin to be open to have maybe difficult conversations with people that may disagree with us, or that may be in our circles that just haven't thought through the issue. I find that a lot of times whenever you get into a conversation with someone that would say they support it, they just haven't thought through it. And so to come with Jesus' compassion and to engage them in a conversation that could lead them to an understanding of life.
That's great. Well, Michael, thank you so much for that. We've got to take a break, but when we come back, more from Point of View right after this.
It is a horrible scenario, but it happens. Dennis writes about his wife who was diagnosed with leukemia. She's now a 2-time survivor. They ran up over $1 million in medical bills. Thankfully, they're MediShare members, and Dennis says they're so thankful for that, how people came together to meet their needs. MediShare works, and it can save you a lot of money. The typical family saves $500 a month. Find out more. Call 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
Every day we face new challenges. At the time of Jonah, the Bible says in Nineveh, they couldn't tell their right hand from their left. But in America today, a bunch of people can't tell men from women. In fact, some say men can be women. Christians are called to proclaim God's truth in every area of life. But who has time to study every crazy new thing the world can think of? I'm glad you asked. Get the information you need every day with Kirby's Viewpoints commentary. Sign up to receive them via email at pointofview.net/viewpoints or find them on the Point of View radio app. Viewpoints commentaries, making sense of the world around us. pointofview.net/viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now,
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. So grateful that you have decided to join us today on this Tuesday, September 10th, 2019 day. I am your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by the one, the only Chelsey Youman of Human Coalition. Chelsey, how are you today?
I'm well today.
So good, so good. Today is TV dinner day. Happy TV dinner day. And so I don't know if you ever, when you were a little during summer, if your parents ever left you at home with your sister and just allowed you to roam free at your house, and they went away to work, or I don't know what that situation was for you. But I remember for us, both my parents worked, and my brother and I, so 16 months apart, were told to behave and given a TV dinner and and a book that two books that we had to read by the end of the week. But other than that, we could do whatever we wanted. So when I think about TV dinner day, I often think about summers with my brother being very rambunctious, to say the very least. What reflect for me on this?
I don't remember, I don't have TV dinner memories.
Okay.
But I regularly, I have TV lunches.
TV
Let's
lunches?
just say that. I'm not actually watching TV, I'm working, but
okay.
I love a real quick, I don't like to cook. So just I will pretty much eat anything that's acceptable.
Yeah.
Low standards, and just power through work through
Summary
lunch.
calendar. I have a room.
Healthy Choice is actually my favorite.
Oh, really?
They've got some real deal chef options.
Yeah, because and they're healthy. I think Marie Callender isn't as healthy. I think there's
She's
a little
good pot pie.
Yeah, one of my roommates used to buy those pot pies in bulk, and we used to make fun of them because I think apparently there's a ton of sodium in there. But nevertheless, as you can tell, I'm not really keeping account of my calorie count. But nevertheless, happy TV dinner day to our listeners out there. We have got quite the next hour for you. We're going to talk a little bit about the saga that continues to embroil the White House right now over the Taliban negotiations, or lack thereof, and the recent news that broke earlier in the show that the National Security Advisor John Bolton resigned. Was he fired? We're not quite sure, and so we'll touch a little bit on that, and then we've got to discuss what's happening at Liberty University right now. Politico put out an expose and an investigative report that indicated some significant indiscretions that are happening at the flagship Christian university here in the U.S. But let's go ahead and jump over to former NSA Director John Bolton right now. So President Trump announced on Tuesday that he had fired John Bolton, his third national security advisor, amid fundamental disagreements over how to handle major foreign policy challenges like Iran, North Korea, and most recently Afghanistan. The president took to Twitter and said, quote, "I informed John Bolton last night that his services are no longer needed at the White House. I disagreed strongly with many of his suggestions, as did others in the administration, and therefore I asked John for his resignation, which was given to me this morning. I thank John very much for his service." Mr. Bolton offered a different version of how the end came with his own Twitter message shortly thereafter. He said, quote, "I offered to resign last night, and President Trump said, let's talk about it tomorrow." Responding to a question from the New York Times via text message, Mr. Bolton said in his initiative offered last night without his asking, He wrote, slept on it, and gave it to him this morning. And so, Chelsey, we're continuing to see the dynamics of the White House play out.
We should call this the Real Housewives of the White House.
The Real Housewives.
It's not disrespectful.
What's happening at the White House right now? Now, I know my particular proclivity, my opinion is that I do not like it when our president tweets. I don't like what's going on over this social media entity, and I definitely don't like how there's a back and forth now between the former National Security Advisor Bolton disagreeing with the president and what is really the truth in this matter. Was it more President Trump's version of the events, or was it Mr. Bolton's version of the events? I'm not a big fan of it. Like, your take on it?
Okay, so that's the substance of the question. So I think that we started this discussion on our first hour by saying, or I started it at least by saying that first and foremost, President Trump's background is that of a business executive. And so we have seen time and time again, a lot of scenarios he approaches are outside of the box in terms of the political, especially on the international relations side, but on the diplomatic side, and even through policy discussions. He does not approach the White House necessarily from a policy or tried and true political approach, but through his business viewpoint, for better or worse.
Yep.
Not a judgmental comment, just neutral. Then you have Bolton, who is pretty much an establishment guy in terms of his experience in a good way. He has an incredible amount of political experience, understands foreign policy to its core. And so it is no wonder at all to me that they are butting heads, because President Trump has done things that a lot of presidents in recent history have not done, which is meet with foreign dictators, terrorists, the North Korean president. He's met a lot with Putin when Putin was doing things to actively undermine the United States, even through his negotiation talks with China. I mean, he just goes where most presidents aren't willing to go and engages in the conversation. Now, wisdom shows on the diplomacy side. I mean, we all know the phrase, you don't negotiate with terrorists. And so to me, I think it's foolhardy mission to invite the Taliban to Camp David 2 days before 9/11. I understand he has an incentive to get us out of Afghanistan. He's ready to end the almost 20-year-old war, or not, maybe even longer if you include the portions of the 90s. So I understand his willingness, but he did make it very clear that he did not even consult with anyone else about A, inviting the Taliban, and then B, canceling the invitation. So he's making these decisions in a bit of a silo, it appears, by his own words. And I think that's foolhardy.
So I think we need to let's look over really what appears to be the substance of their disagreement that's now led to their departure. It largely centers around what was happening potentially over the weekend with the peace agreement that was trying to be brokered at Camp David. Apparently, there was movement over the weekend that President Trump wanted to bring in Afghan government officials, Taliban officials, and then he himself to come in, create a peace agreement, and then to be able to usher that in. Well, one, the optics are not great to bring in the Taliban, which played a pretty significant hand relative to 9/11, the date that lives in infamy now because of what they did. So there's that piece to it. Two, you have Mr. Bolton, who's much more hawkish, had a strong disagreement with President Trump, who was wanting to sign off on a peace agreement. Mr. Bolton did not think the conditions were good for signing off on the peace agreement relative to the long-term health, both from the United States standpoint as well as from the Afghanistan standpoint. President Trump, on the other hand, thought that this would have been a pretty good decision to do. And so Mr. Bolton urged Mr. Trump to reject the agreement, arguing that the president could still withdraw troops from Afghanistan to fulfill his campaign promise without getting into, quote, bed with the organization responsible for killing thousands of Americans over the last 18 years. And so now we find ourselves in a situation in which there is no, Mr. Bolton is now gone from the administration, but we still have a presence in Afghanistan. We're going to pick up on this because there's still 3 or 4 questions left to be answered right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
The Electoral College has become a controversial issue in the last 2 decades, but a recent federal court ruling could make it even more controversial. Judges in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that presidential electors do not have to follow the results of the popular vote in their states. Some worry that a single elector could decide the outcome of a presidential election in a close election. The decision was a victory for one Colorado elector who decided not to vote for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. Instead, he crossed out her name and wrote in John Kasich, then the Republican governor of Ohio. The Colorado Secretary of State removed him and brought in another elector who voted for Clinton. The court ruled that once electors are chosen and report to their state capital in December, they cannot be removed, nor can the state nullify their votes. In the past, the court has ruled that a state may bind the electors, but those laws are weak, and the penalties for being a faithless elector are nominal. It is worth mentioning that the ruling from Colorado conflicts with an earlier ruling from the state of Washington. The state Supreme Court there ruled that electors must follow the results of the popular vote. Now that there are conflicting rulings, it is likely that these cases will make their way to the Supreme Court. Given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, it's difficult to predict how the justices will rule or whether they'll even rule at all before the 2020 election. Nevertheless, I predict that the High Court will uphold the Colorado ruling, given the fact that in the past there have been faithless electors in America's history. And I also predict that some justices will comment on the constitutionality of the Electoral College, given the fact that we've had 2 elections in less than 2 decades decided by the electoral vote rather than the popular vote. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined at the Millennial Roundtable by Chelsey Youman of Human Coalition Action, short version, HUCO Action. We have been talking a little bit about Afghanistan and what's happening there. And I want to expound upon kind of some of the dynamics of what's happening in this region of the world that we have been situated in and fighting for, and fighting alongside Afghan forces for what seems almost now, almost 18 years now. One of the critiques of what's happened in Afghanistan, it's been a revolving door of leadership. And so there are some instances that they're saying that we haven't fought a war for 17 years. We haven't fought one war for 17 years. We fought 17 wars, one per year, for a year. 17 consecutive years, rather. And because there's been a revolving door of leadership from the coalition forces and from American military commanders. It's just been a turntable of the leaders that are happening. But now we find ourselves at a particular vantage point where it's important for us to know what some of the disagreements that are happening right now. So let's identify the players. One, we know that there's Afghan officials right now, Afghan officials that are trying to create a type of government in which there can be peace that is taking place in the land right now. Then separated from the Afghan forces that American forces have been working alongside is the Taliban forces. And we know Taliban for their significant and supportive role that they did in creating a day here in the U.S. that upwards of 3,000 individuals lost their lives on that day on September 11th that we will commemorate tomorrow. What we continue to know is that Taliban forces are trying to be a piece in this new governing structure that's happening in Afghanistan right now. But one of the things that they are driven by, one of their non-negotiables that they have, is they do not want American forces in Afghanistan. So they're not even willing to engage in further conversation toward a peace agreement with the U.S. until the U.S. gets out of the peace agreement. So one of their conditions is the Americans have to move out of peace talks before they're willing to move any further. Well, then there's the American force, American peace dynamics that's happening in the Afghanistan war. Obviously, we've had a fluctuation of troops that have been happening there. One of the tragedies and byproducts of war is that we've had upwards of 2,300 soldiers that have lost their lives in Afghanistan right now, with one soldier passing away even last week because of a car bomb that went off in Kabul. And so that brings us to this particular point. Americans believe it to be true that that we need to be involved in the peace talks in order for peace to be secured. Taliban forces believe it to be true that we cannot be a part of the peace talks. We have to be out of the peace talks before they're willing to even move forward. And so this is where we find ourselves right now. The forces, the kind of workings of President Trump, and again, there's so many pieces relative to his thinking and ideology that he's bringing to the mix right now. It's a reality that, one, he had a campaign promise that he said he wants to bring all the troops home. So President Trump is wanting to withdraw troops as quickly and as swiftly as possible. What Mr. Bolton was arguing for is that there is the potential to bring home troops, but we need to be an active part of this agreement process, because without an American touch in this and presence in these talks, they will not be successful. And so this is where we have this impasse that happened over the weekend, where you have President Trump that is wanting to bring all of these individuals together, because we know that this is our president has a background in reality television. He has an eye for showbiz, and similar to Jimmy Carter when it came to the peace deal he brokered at Camp David, to former President Clinton and the peace deal he brokered at Camp David. There's a history of being at Camp David, having some of these foreign policy agreements taking place. Well, President Trump wanted to usher that in as well over the weekend, but there were individuals, namely, according to some reports that are coming out, the New York Times, as well as other entities, that you have individuals like Mr. Bolton, as well as Vice President Pence, that disagreed that it probably wasn't good optics for the Taliban to be coming onto U.S. soil in Camp David on the weekend prior to 9/11. Which inevitably led for the peace talks to be canceled, the peace negotiations to end. And now we find ourselves, believe there's upwards of still over 10,000 soldiers that are situated in Afghanistan, that are American forces right now. And there is no plan to move forward relative to the peace talks. Chelsey.
I mean, I'm glad that they were canceled. So at least we have that, right? I'd be curious to hear what our listeners actually think about all of this. I think history will tell us a lot about President Trump's general approach and his negotiations with so many foreign entities that are not traditionally negotiated with. I think we'll learn a lot, but at this juncture, it's still pretty early to know the results of that. I do know, however, that the implications do impact our image abroad. So we are viewed generally, I think, as a stronger presence. I've heard through actually a source that Americans traveling to China, for instance, are treated differently than they've ever treated, with far more respect and dignity and politeness than they've been treated with in years and years. And so perhaps we do look like a very strong force abroad, but anytime we go to meet with these foreign dignitaries that are terrorist organizations or dictators, I tend to think that does not bode well for us and does make us look weak. And so far, we haven't seen much made out of that with our stance with Iran or North Korea, and I guess now even the Taliban. So time will tell, but I would be curious what others have to think about that.
Yeah, and so you can call in. We'll start taking some calls right now. What do you think of Mr. Bolton leaving the administration? What do you think of our approach moving forward? We'll open it up to a wide variety of questions relative to your point of view on the situation in Afghanistan right now. Do you think it was a good move for the Taliban to be at Camp David the weekend before 9/11? Think it was the right move or maybe the wrong move? Do you think Mr. Bolton leaving the administration was a good move, bad move? We'll open up the phone lines. You can call in 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212, or you can leave a question on Facebook at facebook.com/Point of View Radio. What you say on online, we'll try to get to over the air as well. And so here's where I'm a little concerned, and where I draw my sympathies with Mr. Bolton is that I thought he had the right approach when it came to the situation that was happening in North Korea. He was very much more hawkish. He's known as being more hawkish than President Trump. President Trump is much more isolationist, has the tendencies of a dove to a certain degree. But Mr. Bolton is much more hawkish, understands the threat that individuals such as Iran, entities such as North Korea, the power that they possess and the evil inherent within some of the leadership there. And I think that's where I'm much more prone to want to take more of a hawkish stance toward them. But I know that our president, as well as there's just a certain zeitgeist in the air right now, Chelsey, for us to be very much pull back American forces, pull back American presence from around the world, which it is an approach. I'm just not sure if it's the right approach in 2019 right now.
I know. Well, another word for that would be that we've heard as isolationist. Mm-hmm. It's so hard to know without the hindsight of history. To really know what I know that President Bush historically took a much more globalizing approach, and as did obviously President Obama to the next level. So I think what President Trump is doing is trying to be protective of the United States on the economic side, on the war front side, trying to wrap up these loose ends and these resource expenditures in terms of even human capital, right? I mean, our armies and our lives, American lives. So I don't really know his personal mindset, but I do know that he is butting heads repeatedly with the State Department, and the overturn of individuals out of that department really is telling. Yeah.
And so we're going to have to take a break. When we come back from the break, we're going to take some of your questions over the phone. And so you can call in 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. I'm going to be really interested because when I think about, there's certain things that I'm pretty concerned about, certain aspects that I'm pretty concerned about. One, I think one of the fatal flaws of the Obama foreign policy was the infamous red line that was drawn, and even when Syria went over the red line, there was no reaction. I think one of the flaws that has happened is is our stance toward North Korea to a large degree to overlook some of the human rights abuses. And so I think that there's room for agreement and disagreement. I'll be interested to hear from you as well. And so we'll go back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is
Nick Pitts.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm your host, Nick Pitts. I'm joined co-host with Chelsey Youman of Human Coalition Action. And we have been talking about the situation in Afghanistan. And so we said we'd open up the phone lines. And so we are going to continue to take some phone calls right now. Your opinions on what's happening in Afghanistan right now. News broke this afternoon that John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, is out at the White House. President Trump is moving on. The Taliban talks to try to broker peace in Afghanistan is on hold now, trying to figure out what the next steps moving forward are. So you can offer up your comments. What do you think about all of these recent moves? John Bolton being out, President Trump moving forward without Taliban. You can call in 800-351-1212. Again, that number is 800-351-1212. We're going to jump on over to Nevada right now. We've got Bonnie on the line. Bonnie, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hey, Bonnie, what's your point of view?
First thing I want to say thank you to Point of View, opening my eyes over the last several years to so many different people that I follow now that I used to never follow. So thank you for opening up the truth. And Chelsey, I totally agree with your whole dog issue, 100%.
Oh, thank you.
That was hilarious. I was rolling on that one. So on the Afghanistan thing, this is what I sort of agree. I don't agree. I agree that he, offering peace talks was sort of a good thing in his game plan. And I don't think his game plan was peace. I think his game plan was, I'm going to show the world that I offered you peace. Mm-hmm. And no, I don't think he would have actually gone through with it, especially not the weekend before 9/11, because he's not stupid. Mm-hmm. He's a smart guy. But now, I don't know how many times we've done it, but we've spent 18 years trying to make that a peaceful nation. And he's wanting our troops out of there. And he's like, look, I'm offering you peace. He showed the world, I'm offering you peace. And they're like, no, we don't want peace with you. And so inviting them was just a final peace offering. So now whatever happens from here, you know what? I'm sorry, you made your bed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You made your bed.
Yeah.
And he showed the world that. So the world can see, you know what? It's not us. It's not America that's evil. It is this nation that is insisting on hating us. So I kind of think in his long-term strategy, I think that was a good thing that he offered that.
Yeah. Bonnie, thank you so much for your phone call. Really do appreciate it. Bonnie brings
You're
up
welcome.
a really great point. There's always the point in foreign policy that there's power and presence, right? And so understanding that you're present, you steward your presence. You just don't show up for anybody. You recognize that there's great power and it's a resource that you have to steward well. So, for example, I can't just walk into the White House and have a meeting with President Trump because I know that being seen with President Trump, there's a certain presence that he has to steward. So he doesn't want to give his time to just anyone. And so I think there's that piece that he needs to be cognizant of. Who does he empower by giving of his time and his presence toward? And then the second piece is that the Taliban have made very clear they don't want us to be a part of the talks. And I do wonder whether we need to be a part of the talks, whether it's a good thing for us to be a part of the talks. Personally, I'm of the persuasion that we need to be there, that if left without our diplomatic tools, I do not think that Afghanistan becomes not just a habitable place, but a place that will not fester and foment terrorism if the Taliban is left to reign and rule. I'm kind of echoing to a certain degree Jim Hansen out of Fox News. He said, quote, "Let's be honest, Afghanistan is ungovernable. Our efforts to create a stable democratic government that will work closely with the U.S. as our ally are hopeless, but we can set a more modest goal, prevent the Taliban from once again turning Afghanistan into a terrorist haven." And so he's offering up similar comments that we need to be a part of that peace process in order to keep the Taliban from turning Afghanistan into what it once was. And we're going to continue taking some phone calls. We'll take one more. We've got Joe right now in Texas. Joe, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks for taking the call.
Hey, Joe, what's your point of view?
Well, let me just real quickly just say I appreciate point of view very much. In fact, this same station that it airs on, I do a talk show a little later this afternoon, a live show. But I'm a minister. I travel all over the world. 2 weeks I'll be in Ghana, West Africa, preaching to 200,000. In February, I'll be in Pakistan, preaching to over, they think, 1.4 million at one time. So I travel a lot. I in and out of countries and deal with stuff. And I just want to say, I don't think it's that unusual for John Bolton to be leaving. He served a long time. Sometimes these talks in the negotiation, you know, the Taliban in this case, or, you know, they might have said, look, we'll talk to anybody, but we don't want to talk to that guy. And so sometimes they just have to change a face to get moving forward. That's not unusual. I've been in government. I was an elected official to
Are you there, Joe?
And sometimes, yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Yep. Okay. So, you know, there are just a lot of factors that go into these negotiations. But as far as the Taliban, ISIS, all of those groups, I just got to say, typically they understand one thing, and that is force. When you have the upper hand, you have the hammer, so to speak, they're willing to negotiate. But once you lose that, they're not quite as quick to negotiate. And I love our president, and we're basically living life as far as foreign countries and negotiate in the aftermath of a failed Obama policy that just created so many problems that it was so bad that, you know, you almost didn't want to tell anybody during that time where you were from in these other countries because of the ridicule. I was in France one time and it happened. And so thank God we got a president that does what he says he's going to do, stands up to them.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that he's having to work on right now is because there was the campaign promise that he was going to pull troops out, but it appears as though that is becoming more of a we're trying to figure out if that's actually going to happen. I think that was one of the reasons why he was so quick to want to rush talks and wanting to get talks conducted, whether they're at Camp David or whether they were just going to happen over the weekend, wanting to try to pull troops, wanting to try to bring home the upwards of 10,000 troops home. But it doesn't appear as though that's going to be happening anytime soon. But it does remind us yet again that we need to be mindful. We need to be prayerful of what's happening over in Afghanistan right now. One of the aspects of what's happened in Afghanistan, I'm keenly aware, is that there are a number of troops that have given of their lives over there. And so they're numbering upwards of 2,300 Americans that have given their lives for the cause. And so we need to be mindful as Christians to know that it's a reminder of God's grace. It's a reminder of that we have been able to live in this country, but also a reminder that we need to be careful as we continue to not let their sacrifices go into vain. One of the pieces that I'm mindful of is these soldiers have fought bravely so that we might live freely. Tragically, last week, a mother lost her child, and we lost a soldier to a suicide bomber in Kabul, which is a city in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, we're losing our connection to the military. 1.3 million men and women serve in the active duty military, and more than 800,000 serve in the reserve forces. 77% of adults 50 and older said they have an immediate family member who served in the military. But among those between the ages of 18 and 29, that number is 33%. So hear that again. If you're 50 and older, there's a 77% of adults said they have an immediate family member who served in the military. But for those younger, that number is 33%. As their courageous efforts become more familiar to us, I worry we won't adequately appreciate them. Over 20 million men and women have served our country valiantly. These individuals risked their future so that we might have one. We will never know the depths of their service, but we should never stop trying to express our appreciation. We have got to take a break now, and so when we come back from the break, we're going to switch gears for this last segment talk about the value of a college education, and bring up a story that is making its way around the internet right now, some of the exploits and some of the scandalous details that are pouring out of Liberty University, which is one of the largest Christian universities in the world. Politico ran an investigative piece that highlighted some very problematic issues and instances that have occurred in the past and seem to be occurring as we speak right now. And so we're going to overview that and try to think about that from a Christian perspective as well. But first, we've got to take a break. But when we come back from the break, more from Point of View. But during the break, I want to encourage you to make your way over to the Point of View website, www.pointofview.net. But when we come back, more from Point of View right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. In our last episode, we learned that memorials with religious symbolism bear a strong presumption of constitutionality, according to Justice Alito's majority opinion in the American Legion versus AHA. But what does that mean? Well, to fully appreciate the court's decision, you need to understand how these lawsuits once worked. Previously, if someone saw what the Supreme Court calls religiously expressive monuments, symbols, and practices, a lawsuit could be filed based on little more than the offense of having been exposed to such a thing on public property. It was called offended observer standing, and as Justice Gorsuch made clear in his concurring opinion, if individuals and groups could invoke the authority of a federal court to forbid what they dislike for no more reason than they dislike it, we would risk exceeding the judiciary's limited constitutional mandate and infringing on powers committed to other branches of government. Instead, those merely offended by the presence of a religiously expressive monument, symbol, or practice must now rebut the presumption that such religious displays are constitutional. That's a far more difficult standard to overcome, and one certain to dissuade suits from even being filed. Of course, there's a reason why the court shifted the burden, and on our next episode of the First Liberty Briefing, we will discuss how the justices are combating hostility toward religion. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. Let me ask you, what if America's best attorneys from the very top law firms got together to defend religious freedom in court? That's exactly what's happening at First Liberty. And the best news? We're winning over 90% of our legal actions. Come learn more at firstliberty.org. You'll be encouraged. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back to Point of View. I am your host, Nick Pitts. For this last segment, I'm joined by Chelsey Youman of the First Liberty. Wow, I was so good.
You took it
I almost
old
had
school.
a perfect game, and then I ruined it at the very end. Oh,
I am now at Human Coalition Action. I do miss my brothers over at First Liberty Institute fighting the good fight for religious liberty, but I am now over in the pro-life movement. So it is a shift. It's an adjustment.
I cannot believe I almost had a perfect game, and then I totally ruined it with that last comment. But nevertheless, we're talking about let's jump over to one of the articles that I really want to illuminate right now. Liberty University. So according to a new Politico magazine article, someone's got to tell the truth. Jerry Falwell's aides break their silence. More than 24 current and former Liberty University officials describe a culture of fear and self-dealing at the largest Christian college in the world. And there probably one illuminating quote right now that I thought was, there's two illuminating quotes that I thought were revealed a very problematic nature in this article. But one of the quotes is from an individual, a senior university official with insider knowledge of Liberty University's finances says, quote, "We're not a school, we're a real estate hedge fund. We're not educating, we're buying real estate every year and taking students' money to do it." There was some negative aspects that were revealed about Liberty University. And so a part of the question that I want to ask of you, Chelsey, one is just your first impressions of the article, just detailing some scandalous details about what was happening what is happening at Liberty University relative to the expenditures, relative to some of the ways in which they're getting some of that money, and the insider dealing that's apparently happening there. And the second piece I want to know is, like, what should we be thinking? Is this a hit job that's done by Politico? Is this substantive? Like, your thoughts?
Oh, well, my first thoughts about the news outlet aspect of this is in my experience, the media will never miss an opportunity to make Christians to scandalize Christians. Yeah. Right. So this is just fodder of information for them. At first, I thought they were making a mountain out of a molehill because I couldn't really ascertain what they were trying to say other than paint him as a bad actor. But they did actually include some facts and apparently had interviewed dozens of people. So the truth is, anytime a Christian institution that really has been a pillar of Christian education in, I guess, for lack of a better term, the evangelicals, that's really unfortunate. And I don't have any personal information about Liberty. I don't know. But there's a board for a reason, a board of directors for a reason. And I think that any Christian organization, whether it's a nonprofit or a ministry or provides aid to people or is an educational institution, they have a duty as a Christian organization to adhere to their statements of faith and to have leadership that comports with that. And so it is really the responsibility of the board of directors to do their job and really maintain the integrity of the institution. And to the extent they're not doing that, is a problem. Now, I don't know anything about the personal finances of the school or know that is real estate investments a bad thing. I know that they've increased significantly into like $1.5 billion of assets in the last 12 years, which is significant, but they've also increased their student body by 95% in that time. It might be 95,000 online. So every educational institution goes through this cycle. I think especially on the Christian realm where they say, are we going to be true to our tenets of our faith or secularize as an educational institution? And those are identity questions for the board to answer. Of course, I have a personal opinion about the answer to that, but really it's on them as an institution to rectify the problem. Yeah.
I think one of the things that I was kind of distraught by to a certain degree is just some of the if it turns out to be true, some of the, and I'm going to believe it to be true. I don't want to walk into things distrustful anymore. I want to believe it. I'm going to report this to be true until I hear otherwise. But I'm also going to be shrewd to a large degree about this. One of the things that I'm disconcerted by is I completely agree with your first claim that the media are often looking for a way to be able to paint evangelicals in a very negative light. And I think that's the reason why that Paul is going to say in Philippians 2 that we need to have conduct that is above.
I completely agree.
So that we can shine
Let's not
like
give
stars.
them ammunition.
Shine like stars in the universe. And it appears as though there were some indiscretions that were done relative to showing some favoritism, relative to some inappropriate language that was utilized that I think was unbecoming of a Christian entity and organization. I think where this is one of the reasons why I think this is very problematic for me is that the higher education institution are already in a perilous situation right now. So for our listeners, here are two numbers that should strike us as being very alarming right now. Many of us probably have a higher education institution that we call our alma mater. But the reality of the matter is, according to one study, 25% of higher education institutions will close their doors in the next 20 years. A Harvard study makes that is much more very much negative on that, and they put it at 10 in the next 10 years. 50% of higher education institutions will close their doors. And this is largely going to target Christian higher education institutions because they typically tend to be smaller in nature. And so what does that look like for us as Christian institutions? One, we need to keep our finances in tip-top order. We need to be prudent in our spending. But then we also need to be innovative in the way that we're offering particular courses as well as services as we make our way into the world. And then we also need to be above reproach relative to our behavior, knowing that, as Chelsey can attest, lawsuits can become very expensive.
Can I say something?
Yep.
This all presupposes that Liberty University still adheres to Christian values, right? So let's not make that assumption, because private schools all over the country, Baylor, SMU, maybe I shouldn't call it any other ones, but some that come to the top of my mind, renounce their Christian roots. They renounce the tenets of their faith. They secularize. They drop their statements of faith. Don't require students to adhere to statements of faith or faculty. So a lot of universities go the public school route for a private school price.
Has Baylor done? I don't think Baylor has done that.
They dropped the Baptist.
Okay.
I mean, some of them still have like a seminary component, but overall it's not the same as DTS or DBU, where they're like really centralized around their Christian faith. A lot of universities secularize. There's one out of Abilene. I'm missing that.
Murray?
No, the big, yeah.
Yep.
Abilene. No, it's the big Church of Christ one. Like the Church of Christ universities have met recently and voted to no longer like include their statements of faith in a bunch of things. This is something that I had a lot of experience with, really identity crisis within the educational institution. And so I would hope that Liberty would continue to adhere to their values. But if they're not, then we can't really claim them.
Yeah, you can't expect a non-Christian entity to act like a Christian.
Right.
You have to have the right expectations. And here's where I'll end the show. And I'll be very. I know that I'm biased, like CNN and Fox News, but I'll say it for what it is. I'm biased because I believe it to be true that Dallas Baptist University, in an increasingly competitive higher education institution world, they're going to continue to pursue after excellence without forsaking their faithfulness. One of the key components to Dallas Baptist University is they're going to integrate their faith in their learning. They're going to not only challenge you inside the classroom, but mentor you outside the classroom to utilize that information so that you might be competent in the field, but also have character when you get out there as well, so that you might shine bright like a star in a dark universe. And increasingly, there's going to be more and more allure to succumb to and weaken faith commitments because there's a greater and greater pool of secular students. But here's where I know to be true. Dallas Baptist University will continue to double down on their faith commitments, but they will not forsake their excellent components. Thank you so much for joining us on Point of View. We'll be back tomorrow.
So when people first hear about MediShare, they have questions. Some good ones, like, what is it? Well, MediShare is a Christian healthcare sharing ministry. It's not health insurance. It's a different way of doing things, which leads us to this question. Why do so many become MediShare members? Two big reasons. They save a lot. The typical family saves $500 a month, and they feel great about it. With MediShare, you aren't forced to pay for things you don't believe in. Find out more. 855-SHARE-40. That's 855-SHARE-40.
It seems we can't get through a day without hearing how science has been corrupted to support political goals. Media entities have sold out truth for the sake of favored narratives. Even some religious groups have abandoned the Bible to support things based on feelings. So who can you trust? Kirby Anderson and the Point of View Truth Team are your source for real news. Learn how you can make a difference by joining the team at pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. In a world of unending fog, Point of View is a shining light. Do your part at pointofview.net/team or 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.